The purpose of this interview is to get an expert to dive into the Gaza conflict, urban warfare, all of the things that you see on social media with people that have no idea what they're talking about. Someone who's been there, done that, have experience, served in the military.
As somebody who studied it for over a decade, every element of what Hamas built in Gaza was designed for war never seen in the history of war. Not the 400 plus miles of tunnels underneath every single building, every step I took, to include when I was in Gaza City. There was more likely than not a tunnel underneath. They completely say and do everything they can to get their own civilians killed, to include killing them themselves. Israel, of course, calls everybody, every civilian in the environment, texts them, leaves voicemails, will actually have a phone bank of hundreds of IDF soldiers calling in to shop leaders, religious leaders, everybody into an environment saying, please leave. Has there ever been a military in the history of war who, in the middle of fighting the enemy, starts feeding its population? It's never happened, not once. But because this is Israel, they're required to.
The propaganda and anti-Semitism has gotten so out of control that we can no longer be quiet anymore. At some point, we got to fight back. At some point, I want to interview people that are going to tell the truth, people that have knowledge, because others are interviewing the nut jobs. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with another incredible interview. And the purpose of this interview is to get an expert to dive into the Gaza conflict, urban warfare, all of the things that you see on social media with people that have no idea what they're talking about. I wanted to bring in an expert to give us some insight. Obviously, he was even embedded with the IDF just recently. So someone who's been there, done that, have experience, served in the military at a high level, trained, all of that. I want to have somebody that know what they're talking about. So ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome to the show, John Spencer, who's the executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute. John, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to get right into this. So you had just told me right before we came on live that you were embedded with the IDF just recently. And one of my biggest questions that I have is, what are your thoughts of this ceasefire? Is it legitimate? Is it just kind of for show? Is it going to last? You know, I want to hear from you about this, given the fact that you've been to Israel, you've been, I guess associated with the IDF and seen the tactics, you've seen Hamas, you've seen what the Gaza environment is like. You know, what's your take on this?
Sure. And so thanks for having me. A big fan of the show. Yeah. So I just got back last week from my sixth time into Gaza, not associated, but doing research. My job is to do research on urban warfare around the world, 6 times into Gaza. The biggest urban centric challenge that any military has faced in the history of warfare. And I can say that as somebody who studied it for over a decade. Every element of what Hamas built in Gaza was designed for war, never seen in the history of war. Not the 400 plus miles of tunnels underneath every single building, every step I took, to include when I was in Gaza City. There was more likely than not a tunnel underneath me. And that was how Hamas designed everything. It spent billions of dollars to do that. How it uses the human sacrifice also hasn't been seen in war. The Nazis didn't do that. The Japanese didn't do that, where they completely say and do everything they can to get their own civilians killed, to include killing them themselves, to achieve their warped political ideology and their goals that they want. You asked me about the ceasefire. There are some nuances there. Somebody who teaches war, what is a ceasefire? What is the end of war? What does it look like? This was, of course, thanks to President Trump, the most comprehensive peace plan the Middle East has ever seen, even against an evil terrorist group like Hamas, which it does allow Hamas an off-ramp, exile, of course, everything for the Palestinian people, but it also accounts for what if Hamas keeps being Hamas and just does crazy things. This plan rallies a bunch of other countries because war is political, and it's more than just the two actors involved, Israel and Hamas. Of course, we know, especially this area that shares a border with Egypt, which has also never happened in war. There's never been a country like Egypt that says, look, it's awful, it's bad, but you can't come into my country, not you civilians, not the children, not the women, nobody. They actually built a new wall since October 7th. It's insane. Do I think this period will last? And I've been really advocating that this plan is unlike any other plan because it's conditions based. We've seen President Trump already. Of course, the living hostages back is of course, massive for the small Israeli population, and the number equivalent to what that would look like in America is just insane. So that's a huge win for them. But of course, their goal is to have security, and Hamas is an evil organization. It likely will breach and not do the other terms, which are vital. Like step one of the plan is Hamas or Gaza will become a de-radicalized, terror-free zone. And then it lays out all the plan and all the people that will help with it. Right now, Hamas is already saying, well, we're not going to disarm. And the beauty of the plan, though, Brennan, is that it says, I don't care what Hamas says. Hamas, you start a war, you lose a war, you don't get to vote. And this plan, all the 20 points actually accounts for. Now, in the urban warfare perspective, it'll still be extremely difficult. So do I think that this is a chance for the fighting to end and the killing to end? It's the best plan that's ever been put forward, but that doesn't mean Hamas won't keep being Hamas.
That's a pretty good perspective. I want to dig into a couple things that you said, because this is something that I think the Israeli, I don't know, government, their PR, they just miss this every time. When you say that Hamas kills their own people in the warfare, in their warfare endeavor, what do you mean? Like, what is the evidence to that, and what does that actually look like? Like, we've seen them just kill people recently, right? They put them out in the street and they blow their heads off right in front of everybody for the world to see. But in the wartime scenario, what were they actually doing and killing their own citizens?
So step one is, well, I've been very vocal and been quoted many times because I do this for a living. I run the only course in the world for militaries to train it. Israel has done more to prevent the harm to civilians than any military in the history of war, to include the US military, and how they do notifications and try to beg civilians to leave areas so they can move in and attack Hamas. The number one thing that Hamas does, a part of this human sacrifice, is demand that civilians not leave areas because they're using them as shields and sacrifice. Number two, which is evidence that's pretty objective, is that I study war around the world. I just got back from Azerbaijan. I've been to Ukraine many times. The underground that is in Gaza is forbidden for civilians to go into. But in that 400 miles, and they public statements, so these aren't John Spencer's opinions, these are public statements by Hamas many times. There's 400 plus miles of tunnels. There's probably way more than that. And I looked into that. Every civilian in Gaza could fit in those tunnels with ease, but there's never been a single one allowed, to include Hamas saying, you're not allowed in these. These are not for civilians. We need the death. So this is the other statements. Believe the enemy, believe all sides when they say, Israel says, our war is not with the people of Gaza, it's with Hamas. We'll believe them. Hamas says, we need the death of our women and children, the blood of our martyrs to achieve our goal, which is the destruction of Israel. So by action, not allowing civilians into it, keeping civilians during this last operation, Hamas put out written guidance. If you evacuate, you will face severe consequences. It does the same thing if you take food from the Gaza Health Foundation, which was an Israeli American, but it's mostly American contractor, said if you take food from them, we'll kill you. Every element, the fact that they shoot their own people, same thing, roadblocks for civilians trying to get out of the combat areas, just every element. But it's mainly as a political analysis, the statements of their leaders that say, the civilians must die for us to achieve our goal. And look what we achieved. Just recently, the Hamas leader said, look what October 7th in our war achieved. It got us a Palestinian state that we will rule and continue to destroy Israel with. They actually, in their warped ideology, believe that the death of their civilians is the path to their, not even their freedom, because they're not freedom fighters, to their warped position that they want.
It's interesting that you say that, because I just wish that somehow Israel could figure this out and articulate very clearly the brutality that Hamas is doing against their own people. I mean, I think, and I don't mean to be funny about this, but I think Stevie Wonder can see that their tactic is to hide in tunnels, to use facilities that should be preserved for civilians, meaning the hospitals, the places of worship, the schools. I mean, all of these things are supposed to be off limits, but they have interfered in that by making their headquarters at hospitals, by having people stage as journalists, and all of the nuanced things that they do to infiltrate the population, to create an environment where innocent people, some of them are and some of them are not, that end up getting killed in this warfare scenario. But I want you to speak a little more to the actual tactical reality of what Israel put forward trying to eliminate Hamas, meaning what were the tactics that they used? We know a little bit about the leaflets, but how does that work? How effective are the leaflets being dropped, the announcements, the phone calls, the evacuation zones? Like, how effective is that in their urban, engagement?
Absolutely. It's a great question, actually, because I've listed like 10 things that Israel does that nobody in the world has ever even attempted. But then people will say, well, John Spencer, they're not effective. And they use some numbers game to say, like, despite all they're doing. So you're right. They're called civilian harm mitigation measures, like notification, which isn't a requirement in war. Like you're actually telling the enemy you're coming. You're telling them exactly where you're going and what time you're coming. But for the humanitarian imperative, leaflets is pretty much, we were doing it in World War II. We've done it in almost every war. It's the way to notify. You sometimes will air things on the TV and the radio. Israel, of course, calls everybody, every civilian in the environment, texts them, leaves voicemails, will actually has a phone bank of hundreds of IDF soldiers calling in to shop leaders, religious leaders, everybody into an environment saying, please leave. That was in November of 2023. They're doing that. Even before they're trying to get their hostages back. They do something called roof knocking, where they have a building that is being used by Hamas and there's tunnels under it or using for intelligence or whatever it is. They'll call everybody in the building. They'll give them an hour. They'll drop non-explosives on the roof saying, we're serious, we're about to attack this building, then they'll attack it. But beyond that, they put drones with speakers, they drop speakers by parachute. Then they started handing out their maps. No military has ever done that in history. I actually teach militaries how to fight in urban warfare and develop these maps. Israel started putting that on the leaflets and giving it to civilians and then communicating with them on a day-to-day basis, saying, if you're in area 208 of this city, please stay away from it. That's where we'll be, giving up their element of surprise. They started doing daily pauses in November of 2023. They would pause every day of the battle, which we could talk about the humanitarian aid, which is also historic. Israel would pause every day of the battle saying, for these 4 hours, we will not conduct any operations to allow any civilians who haven't left yet to get out of harm's way. There's so many elements of this now using facial recognition. So everybody who wants to condemn Israel about these civilian risk notifications goes back to November of 2023 when the war started, right? When the actual Hamas's 40,000 fighters and 5 brigades, 24 battalions, and it's a war. They don't want to go to like the Battle of Rafah where the IDF use all these technologies and tactics and get 90+% of the civilian population. So much so there's no report of how many civilians died because it's so low in the battle for Rafah. And then you go to the Battle of Gaza City, where I just was, same thing, all the same notifications. I mean, Israel will build a road so that civilians can get out of harm's way. They actually built roads in battle for the sole purpose of allowing civilians to evacuate. And that's what I saw is the IDF always was trying to get 100% of the civilians. They actually have color-coded maps. Now, they were handing out their maps, but they're tracking all the civilians by their cell phone, drone footage, all of this. So they have these color-coded maps to tell you if there's any civilians, whether it's Hamas or a civilian, which is really hard to tell because they only wear the uniforms during the ceasefires.
Right.
So they had these color-coded maps that tell them there are civilians in that area and they won't go in that area. And then they just try to find the Hamas that are bold enough to be in their tunnels and they'll pop out like gophers. And that actually happened while I was there and try to shoot an RPG at the IDF or something. It's just miraculous that doing this, again, moving the civilian population very effectively. And while Egypt says you can't leave the combat areas, never happened in history that one country built a wall saying you have to stay in there. You have to stay there and let Hamas use you as a shield. You could have let everyone out. But the fact that Israel was still successful at destroying the Hamas military, it destroyed it. It doesn't exist anymore. As you know, all the leadership's gone, most of the fighters, and of course they recruit new fighters because they control all the money. So the average Hamas recruit for the last year has been 16. So that gets you into the
Mm,
how many children have died.
mm.
Hamas and everybody else rates anybody below the age of 18 as a child. So of course, a majority of Hamas at this point, new recruits, are children, and that's the radicalization that people just won't talk about. I mean, Hamas would run summer camps, during the summer. Before this, 50 to 100,000 kids, 5 to 15, training military style how to kill Jewish people in Israel.
Hmm. And I can hear the naysayers coming in the feed and saying, well, he's a Zionist or he's a person that advocates for Israel. How can I trust what he's saying? So the question would be, how can people trust what you're saying about all this? Because it seems miraculous and it's not publicized. So what is your response to that when the naysayers come and say, well, he's biased? How can I trust what he has to say?
Oh, and believe me, I've faced that over the last 2 years because I started the lies started on October 8th. I mean, really. And as somebody who has studied it, I happen to be the guy with the knowledge going, that's not true. Here's what's happened. Here's what the law of war requires. Here's what the IDF are doing. And that's why I've been now 7 times, because I'm not going to just believe what I see. I want to see on the ground. What are they doing to protect civilians? How are they trying to find Hamas? What are the tactics? What I say is that, everybody can have their own opinion, but they can't have their own facts. Where are they getting the information? They say, John's only listening to the IDF. Like, no, I'm actually listening to what Hamas says. And I watch all that Hamas says, and I'm on the ground doing my own research, not on some group bus tour or anything, actually observing them in operation. So when somebody says you can't trust me, this gets to this whole antitrust post-COVID world that we live in. Like, so they attack your expertise. They think you have a bias. So I've had hit teams on me since October 7th. Like, how much is Israel paying? And I'm not getting the $7,000 post money, but legitimate deep investigations into my personal professional career saying, how much are they paying you? Nobody's paying me anything. My job is to do research around the world. So maybe that gives me a little credibility because I don't just talk about Israel and I didn't start covering war on October 7th. And if you think that I'm biased or inaccurate, come bring your receipts. Why do you think that the IDF are targeting civilians? Because as I'm showing you 1,000 things they're doing to avoid civilians and begging civilians to get out of harm's way so they can get to Hamas, because they're really good at killing Hamas. That's a fact. And you shouldn't mourn the death of terrorists, but they're really good at killing terrorists. That's just part of the process. I don't know how to alleviate the bias concern. I mean, I bleed red, white, and blue. I'm an American. Of course, I do believe Israel has the right to exist, and the revisionist history that you deal with, a lot of people trying to rewrite history, and like they think that's just ridiculous. And I care because I have kids, but um, the truth really matters.
Yeah, and I'm glad you had mentioned these things. And there's another thing about the feed zones because this is one thing that I looked up that was very suspicious to me. At first it started out saying that Israel was blocking baby formula, and they showed these fake pictures of all these babies dying, which is very suspicious to me. And then they come out and say Israel was intentionally starving the people, and then they come out and say Israel wasn't giving any aid whatsoever and that there was a famine that was going on, all responsible for Israel. I went to ChatGPT, which is why you can't trust ChatGPT with everything, because I wanted to see how fair they were, because there was also rumors of IDF soldiers just mowing down people for no reason. So I go to the site and I say, is Israel or IDF killing civilians? It tells me, yes, it's killing civilians or whatever. No reference point, no video, no evidence, no nothing. It just said that it was. I said, is Hamas killing their own civilians? It says there's no evidence of this. Here's another thing I put in there. I said, is Hamas stealing the aid? Because how in the world are they eating? They're not going out to the feed zone themselves with uniforms on eating the food. So how are they getting food? And so I said, are they stealing the food? It said no. But then it had a caveat. It says 96%, according to UN, 96% of all of the aid that comes into Gaza is looted. And then it promoted a group that I've never heard of. They call them gangs that come and steal the food. And they eliminated Hamas from the conversation altogether. So, what's your take on that? Being involved, going to Israel multiple times, were they starving these people? Was it a tactic to starve them? Is it all a lie? What's your thoughts on that?
100% all lie based
Mm.
on, and this is access to information that everybody has, but you're right, it's the social media generated consensus, the court of public opinion. And where are you getting your numbers? How does that person get their numbers? Part of the game. Of course, I've been there many times and seen fields of aid. I was where the old American pier used to be, the fields of aid waiting to be picked up. And everybody wants their information in a 30-second clip, though. They don't want to hear the long conversation of why is that statement false and a twisted narrative, so much so that it becomes, there's a kernel of truth that becomes a lie, or a lie by omission, which is, there's a lot of mainstream media that do lies by omission, where they might add, for just to forget a little word here, but no starvation, just for the sheer tonnage of food, but not just food. I mean, Israel vaccinated the entire population of Gaza in war, every
Mm,
child, every city of polio during the war. They helped establish 14 field hospitals. They brought in 2+ million tons of aid, 1 ton of aid per person. It's, the numbers are ridiculous, but then you have these twisted moments, and you have the twisted narrative that the UN, who only counts its trucks. So then it becomes a numbers game.
mm,
Oh, there's not enough trucks going in. But if you go there and you listen to or just watch, I mean, it's insane. And like you said, I've never seen an emaciated Hamas member. They're usually overweight, fat dudes, and there's lots of pictures of that. But then they'll take this. Well, they stopped the aid. They were blocking aid going in, and there's this period for 10 weeks where there's no aid trucks going in, because there was a 43-day period before that when 600 plus trucks a day, 25,000 trucks in 43 days went into the Gaza Strip and flooded it. So then they were trying to move the aid to the south to try to get Hamas out of that money. Hamas made like $1 million per truck. It's insane. And that's how they
mm,
paid their fighters. So imagine, why would somebody stop fighting if the only way they can feed their families is by earning money through Hamas to buy the aid that Hamas stole and then sells. So like then you see this, like these markets, and if you look up, you can see these markets that look like bazaars. I mean, they got Nutella, they got fresh crop, they got fresh everything. Like, how's that mission? That's a mismatch of information. What we're being told. There's a UN guy that said 14,000 children will die in a matter of weeks if aid doesn't get in. It's just the insanity of the lies, where a lie will travel the world 3 times before the truth puts on its pants, is true even more so than it ever was, because nobody wants to believe, of course, Israel or the IDF on, no, no, we sent this much aid in today. We just started a water pipe that's putting 14 million cubic liters of water in a day. We just connected all the electricity. Like, none of that. No, no, they're starving because they won't quit the war, is what it became. So it was a narrative, and there were populations that were in need of food because of the combat situation and how difficult. This gets back to the Israel feeding its enemy's population. And I wrote this article, and you put this into ChatGPT. Has there ever been a military in the history of war who, in the middle of fighting the enemy, starts feeding its population? It's never happened, not once. But because this is Israel, they're required to, and they did for many reasons. But there's never, not World War One, two, Vietnam, Korea, nothing. And you don't feed the enemy's population inside the battle area, especially while they're holding your hostages. It just never happens. So the insanity is, it's all lies. It's just lies in some form and a distortion of the truth on the ground. And there are reasons for that, which group, whether UN titled group like these commissions, or who's saying that information, and how are they using their information for a narrative, which is usually anti-war. And I have to deal with these people. Like, yeah, kumbaya, you want to live in a world without war. And if just one side would just stop, it would all get better. We're seeing right now what happens when Israel stops operations against Hamas. They're doing what they've been doing to their population. I mean, what's the insanity that Hamas are billionaires in Qatar, and if they were in Gaza, they were millionaires, but 90+% of the civilian population are in poverty, needing a meal every day. Like, these things are just, I know you get this common sense stuff, this doesn't make any sense. But when you argue with some of these people, like, are you, it's almost like there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Are you so dumb that you don't know you're dumb? And this is where we're at.
Yeah, I think it's so it's such common sense. And if you actually cared, But people claim that they care, but if they actually care, they'll do a little more digging, right? You would think, you would say, okay, that is kind of strange that the war is going on and they're feeding people. The fact that they're trying to feed them at all is crazy. When it comes to if they were trying to commit a genocide. And I blew up on Piers Morgan's show just yesterday because everybody was talking in this weird environment where they're not living in reality. It's almost like Israel is reprimanded because they were doing the best they can, but they didn't do enough. It's like they didn't have to do anything, to be honest. They got attacked. These people are attacking them. They can respond, and they can respond with as much violence as they think. But here's another question that I want to bring up to you: like the numbers of deaths. Something we touched on just a little bit ago, but the numbers of deaths are confusing to me, right? Because these numbers are coming out. I don't know what third party group is evaluating these numbers to make sure they're actually true. Then they're conflating civilians with combatants, and then they're conflating and not being transparent about what is a child, right? They throw out a number, 20,000 children have died. Well, wait a minute. Everybody from 17 down is considered a child. How many of those children are combatants? How many of those children are little bitty kids? And I want you to touch on that, but before you get to that, the videos, man. Like I watched all the videos, and this is what made me lose my mind like a month or two ago, because I had watched the videos and the Gaza stuff is just showing up my feed, and it all looked staged. It looked like lies. Little kids that got stuff wiped on their face, and if you watch the video long enough, the other kid over there is having a good time and playing. You see a woman holding an emaciated kid, but she's fat. It's like, well, you would think you give your kid the food and you not eat very well. What is going on? So, what is your thoughts and what information do you have for us about the actual numbers of people who have died in Gaza in this war?
Sure. So two big topics. One, the uniqueness to this war, as I said, many of these elements of urban warfare just haven't ever been seen. And that's why it's the biggest challenge that any military, let alone if you're Israel, which is, there's almost like an Israeli standard to war. The social media aspect. There's never been a war in the history of war which is fed to the phones of the entire world, billions of people on a day-to-day basis. And the algorithm actually drives that stuff to you. And I'm sure as you started looking for stuff, it just started
Yep.
driving things to you.
Yes, it did.
So, these naive kids in Western world that are getting fed pictures of dead babies and destruction that looks awful. It is awful. War is hell, as they say. But on top of that, and it isn't new to Gaza or even Judea, Samaria, West Bank, is something called Pallywood, Gaza Wood, where they have, and there's actually a really famous guy, unfortunately his name was Mr. Fafo, who was the director of these things. And he had lived his life, like thousands of life. He was a doctor, he was a journalist, he was like all these things. They have entire media corporations. I mean, it took almost a year and a half to 2 years for Israel to kill Hamas's main propagandist, Abu Daida. He was responsible for generating these videos. He would monitor trending things and then seek and send movie crews out to create those scenarios, whether it was starvation, whether it was the death of children, whether it was all of these things, targeting of whomever. They would see those things trending and then create the videos to match the algorithm so it could take it. So it's a thing. The numbers, okay. So this is where I really injected myself as somebody who has case studies, right? I have like 200 publications. I really like doing case studies. So you can say is like, how does this compare to any other situation? So the numbers started really becoming a thing early on in the war, this civilian to combatant ratio thing, which as somebody who studied war, I mean, I was served for 25 years, studied it for 10, scholarship of a great amount. Nobody's ever been asked in war, yeah, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? It's too high. It's not the way that war works. And you touched on kind of the central nerve is, well, where'd you get the number? In this case, they get it from Hamas. That is a fact. The Gaza Health Ministry is Hamas by fact. Yes, there's some people who are less Hamas. They're not the Hamas military wing, although there are some of them doctors and part of the Gaza Health Ministry as well. But the number comes from Hamas. And as somebody who studies urban warfare, I mean, the 2016 battle against ISIS in Mosul was the largest urban battle since World War II. And I can tell you for a fact, and it went for 9 months, there was nobody saying on a day-to-day basis how many civilians were dying Because the same thing, if the combatant wears civilians, who's standing over a body going, that person was a combatant involved in the war. This person was an innocent civilian not involved in the war. Of course, civilians have tragically died, but then they don't want to hear about all the things Israel does to prevent it and all the things that Hamas does to increase it. There is no number. The number comes from Hamas. And if you're a common sense person, I would ask anybody, has anybody seen the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry died of natural causes list? Doesn't exist. They're on the list. The videos that we're seeing right now of Hamas, there's no IDF, they pulled back, of Hamas killing Gazans. I guarantee you they'll be on the list. If you've died for any reason since October 7th, you're on that list no matter who you are, what you are doing. Died of natural causes, which is, you got to figure, just estimating like 10,000 a year at least. If you died because of the 20,000 Hamas rockets, 20% of those landing inside of Gaza, killing civilians, you're on the list. If you died on October 7th attacking, raping, murdering, burning, killing Jews, you're on the list. So this is the insanity of the list and the idea that you can say civilian combatant. And then and I know they press you on peers just like they do me, but John, the children, you're right about the children, even the number 18 and below UN. So if somebody uses 17 and below, I joined the military 17. Would I be a kid on that list? And the fact that they use child soldiers, it's validated. I mean, it's a thing, but they're appeal to emotions, not appeal to facts about what is the number, where did the number coming from? Is this number in comparison to any other scenario, although there isn't any? And this is where I've been quoted in the beginning saying that, like the Battle of Northern Gaza, the ratio of how many civilians were being reported versus what IDF, got to believe them if you're going to believe Hamas, of combatants that was dying was lower than these other urban battles, although this is a war. But like I said, if you go to Rafah, nobody wants to talk about that because the numbers of combatants that are killed, and they killed thousands of Hamas in that battle in Rafah, and the numbers of civilians are in the tens, if not hundreds, the ratio wouldn't work. But in general, this is not how war works. If it was, nobody would be able to defend themselves, and everybody would use their civilians as shield until they got to a number. But the same thing for women. The idea that a woman couldn't be involved in the war at all. And
Yeah.
so in my world, there are combatants and non-combatants. A non-combatant's protected. You can't target them. That's the principle, the main principle. You don't target civilians. Now, if you're a combatant, you're a member of Hamas, but you can also do a whole bunch of other things to become a combatant. Like, let's say, holding hostages in your home, which civilian doctors, journalists, everybody did that as well. You're not a civilian, you're a combatant. But when Israel did this one like movie level hostage rescue, and they got back for their hostages, that 200 civilians were immediately reported by mainstream media as dying. No Hamas died in the operation, just 200 civilians. But it's every strike. And the fact that every strike will happen, Brennan, and somebody will have a number within minutes, not hours, not days, not months. In the 2016 battle against ISIS in Mosul that I told you about, it was a year later that the Iraqis did not know how many civilians died, because there's no real-time counter in war that's telling you this is how many civilians. But for some magical reason in Gaza, we believe that Hamas has the ability down to the single digit to tell you how many civilians have died. And then they produce these lists, which people have, torn up, as in that person died of cancer in 2014. That person got older. There's 3 versions of your list. That person got younger as you produce the list. That's the level of insanity. And then you had the mainstream media, lastly. At first, they would put the caveats, like the journalistic standards that we expect. Like they would say, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, who doesn't distinguish, or to the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry. Now they just say, this many Palestinians have died in the conflict. And usually they'll say, if they're nefarious, say Israel killed them. They won't say like they died for all these other reasons. But I don't mourn the death of terrorists in a war who started a war personally. And if you think that I'm biased because of that, then that's awful on that person. But the numbers are just, it's a version, and it's a really great book if any listener ever wants it, called Lies, Damn Lies, Statistics. And it's a known thing in media, in social studies, sociology, to find a number, make the number as big as you can to make it a problem as big as you can. So nobody's talking about the 85,000 children under the age of 5 that have died in Yemen from actual starvation. No, we got to make the number as big as we can in Gaza and report it, because if Israel stops, it all ends. And we're clearly seeing that that's not true.
That is absolutely amazing. I wonder, because I know people try to eat you alive online. They do the same with me. And it's like, they're going to eat crow. Now, they're never going to actually eat crow. They should eat crow. When we find out that there is probably 1,500 civilians or something that have died in this, 90+% of these people are combatants, 90% of the numbers are wrong. And, you know, the day will come possibly when we do an investigation and go back and check the numbers and realize they lied. There's a young lady that was on with me on Pierce Morgan yesterday, and she had made mention that they said that there was like 70,000 buildings that were destroyed, which would mean that there was more buildings than civilians destroyed, which means that how many civilians could have died in the buildings that were destroyed, right? I mean, now that 60,000 died in one building, you're saying all the buildings that were taken down. Then you have to say, well, how are people dying? There's no video footage of IDF just killing random people. There's plenty of video of Hamas doing it, but there's no video of the IDF doing it. So I'm wondering, will the day come where we see the real numbers, and then people will have to fess up to their lies and deception. But one thing I want to ask you, which is the most important thing, and as we close here, unless you have something else you want to add,
I do
is
have that number. The number
go
could be
ahead.
higher. It could awfully be higher. There could be a higher number of Hamas that were killed, and there could be. That isn't how war works. It's not post facto, and that's what everybody wants it to be, right? They give you a new number, like 90% of the buildings destroyed, like all these things. They don't care about the context. The way the laws of war work and the proportionality and everything, it's about what you know before you take action and what have you done to prevent harm. So going back to, have civilians died? Absolutely. And Israel has done more to stop the death of civilians, to include giving up all of their supplies. So they've lost almost 1,000 soldiers, and many Israelis are very critical on, like, well, you are doing things to give away your elements of surprise against Hamas in order to, as a moral imperative, prevent the harm to civilians. So I'm not saying the numbers higher or lower. I know that there isn't a number yet, but then to use that as your sole determination of whether Israel was doing something right, wrong, moral, ethical, is not the way this works at all. And that will be something that I will push for going forward. Is shame on people who took the Hamas number on how many civilians were dying, how many people were dying. It's a war unlike anything that we've seen really in history, on how much. One, there's a country who could have prevented tens of thousands of deaths, Egypt, just letting them into the Sinai desert. And that Hamas, unlike any other rule of any population, has purposely wanted the death of their civilians.
So the big question here, and I got to correct this because somebody going to screenshot this and go, "You said 1,200 people." I was exaggerating the number. You know, I'm just saying that if it's some ridiculous change, once we really find out what happened, and it's the same. You make a really incredible point, and I hope people can catch that. It's the same thing in America, where you say police have killed 1,600 people, and so you're like, there's no context to that. Just the killing of people by police isn't necessarily that it's a negative or evil thing that's happening or something nefarious. It could be because how many of those people pulled a gun on a police officer? How many was self-defense? And I hope that same standard is applied in this situation. But the biggest question I want to ask you, probably the most important question, is why? Why are people so delusional about this? You would think without the propaganda, if people had an impartial perspective, we wouldn't even be arguing about this war. We wouldn't even be mentioning the war. I mean, I think maybe a couple people would have said something, but it wouldn't even have been as bad. Like, people are attacking me online, saying I'm getting paid, saying I'm bought and paid for. I'll never follow you again. You've compromised. It's like, so in your opinion, John, why do you think that people are so caught up in this and believing Hamas and crying in the middle of the streets, talking about free Palestine, and they won't even mention free Palestine from Hamas? Like, why is it going this way?
So there's many reasons. One, like we said about the seeing into war like they've never seen. And you have a lot of people who have identity crisis themselves. They want some cause to fight for, and they have their social medias pushing them all this hate towards Israel, and then that becomes their cause. And they're wearing Hamas bandanas in New York City and flying Hezbollah flags. It's insane that they're so desperate for identity that they've misapplied who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, even of the Palestinian people. And there is an element of anti-Semitism, as I studied this war specifically, that there was no other explanation from like an institutional perspective, right? There's this 3Ds test that this guy, Natan Sharansky, developed. If there's a double standard, 100% double standard for Israel against in this war period, if you try to delegitimize Israel's right to exist or its right to defend itself, and then if you demonize, which is a part of all of this, right, is that you think that the nefarious Israeli IDF is trying to do ethnic cleansing, genocide, starvation. It's like there's that demonization part on there, despite all the evidence you're being given. That's a huge part of this. So there's some ancient hate being that was tapped into by Hamas in their information operations strategy. But this devil has many hydras, to including our academic institutions, right? The chairs in like all these Ivy League colleges that profess the evil Israeli colonists and what it's done to the people, despite the actual history of all these wars 48, 67, 73, when all of these Arab nations will attack Israel. And then Israel's the only country after being attacked to go, okay, but you got to give everything back and everything has to be okay. But you actually have institutions, which has been a big part of this, to include scholars, which I consider myself, who have not only drunk the Kool-Aid of a rewritten Middle Eastern history, they teach it to young people. And then there is this hate that this is all Israel's fault, right? And I was just on last night on TV with somebody going, well, this is, of course, Israel's long history of, the open air prison, like all these stuff that just doesn't make common sense if you've ever actually even been on the ground.
Mm.
So the hate was wrapped in this awful view into a high intensity war. If you've studied war before, like, yeah, this is bad. And what Hamas is doing is awful and it's crazy. How would you even start this? Of course, the United States would do this a lot differently because we can. But there's a lot of answers. It is not an easy to answer. I've discovered some of them. And one of these is that we have a critical thinking crisis in our society. I honestly
To
believe
say
it.
the least.
I mean, to
Yeah,
say
to
the
say the
least.
least, man. To
Say the
say
least.
the least. I
Like you
mean,
said, any common sense person, like, okay, this is what dumbass is telling me.
yeah.
I'm going to check that out a little bit. Like, I'm going to,
Right. I mean, it's out of control, man. I see people online that are very prominent that literally are saying that Israel killed Charlie, and I mean with conviction, and like will shun you if you dare think that the person that has been arrested with a mountain of evidence against him, which is associated with the actual problem in our country that we've seen play out year over year over year, this leftist hatred and ideology to commit violence against people that they don't want to argue with is perpetuated and is clear, but people will still blame Israel for this. So I know we're running out of time. I want to talk about or let the people know, how can they find you, follow you? I want you to talk about your book just real quick, because I know you got a book you wrote in, well, you wrote one more recently, but the one in 2020 that's behind you is the Understanding Urban Warfare. And then the other one is Connected Soldiers. Can you just tell us about your books and how can people buy them, find them, all of that good stuff?
sure. So I put all my publications in johnspenceronline.com. So you can get all three of my books. I actually wrote a book for Ukrainians to defend after it was invaded on using urban warfare against to protect your cities. But that book, Urban Warfare, is really analysis of what is urban warfare, how has it gone in history, which has become very useful. Again, the case studies in that aspect. Connected Soldiers is my own memoir from my own experiences in Iraq. With many of these challenges, but never, nothing like what I've seen in Gaza. But I'm also on social media a lot, on X, on Spencer Guard. But really, that johnspenceronline.com is all my publications and media appearances and all of that, because I've written, even since October 7th, 61 reports or articles trying to debunk the lies. It's almost like playing whack-a-mole on the craziness of the lies about Israel, war, what's allowed, what's not allowed, the numbers game, all of this.
Yeah, it's great, man. I'm glad you came on. You know, it's time for us to start fighting back, man, because I and others thought that this was a cut and dry thing. And we realized that the propaganda and anti Semitism has gotten so out of control that we can no longer be quiet anymore. And we can no longer act as if, oh, we don't want people to think this. And then now it's like at some point we got to fight back. At some point, I want to interview people that are going to tell the truth, people that have knowledge, because others are interviewing the nut jobs and the wacky folks that's pushing conspiracies and they have agendas. And that's one of the reasons why I want to bring you on, John, because obviously you've done an incredible job with your body of work, you know, the things that you've done, the books that you've written, the tours that you've done, the serving in the United States military honorably for so many years. I don't know how many years you said, 25 plus years.
Yeah.
And so all of that gives you the real credence and validity. And I would challenge anybody that's watching this, if you somehow don't believe it, go do your research. Come show me receipts and put it in the comment section, and then I will have something to say. But God bless you, John. Thank you so much for coming on, man. And I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.